In today's episode, a starving black bear jumps out of the bushes towards an elderly man and his wife. Throwing himself in front of his wife, the bear unleashes a brutal attack on the man, ripping him to pieces. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying black bear attack on Robert Harris Weaver. Welcome to Final Affliction. September in Alaska is one of the most picturesque times of the year to visit the state. It's the month where summer just starts to lose its hold. The landscape turns crisp and clear, and it's sprinkled with the orange and yellow hues of autumn. This is also the final flurry of activity in the vast wilderness. Animals hurry to finish their winter dens and to eat what last living morsels are left growing to build up as much fat as they can for the long winter months ahead. Once the winter truly settles in, both animals and humans are confined by the snow and ice that blanket the landscape. Robert Harris Weaver, or Chupa as his friends like to call him, and his wife Nina were taking advantage of the last of the good weather that September. Robert was an Alaskan native. The only time he'd left his home state for an extended period of time was to attend university. But once he got his degree and met Nina, he and his new wife came back to Robert's home. There, they'd raised their children, and Robert took over his old man's business. Now that the children were grown and out of the house, raising kids of their own, Robert was slowly phasing out of the family business, handing it over to his son, just like his father had done before him. Robert and Nina had the leisure of going hunting, fishing, or just staying at their cabin beside Lake George whenever they felt like it. However, this trip was a special one. Robert wanted to catch the last phase of the hunting season, hoping to bring down a moose for himself and maybe a few more to hand out to his grown-up children. They also planned to check on the cabin to get some last-minute repairs done and drop off a few supplies before the first snowfall of the season. After the season came to an end and the snowfall became too deep to navigate through, he and Nina were going to spend their first ever winter in their cabin alone. In the years before, their trips were always with their children or friends, and then only in the spring and summer. But since they were technically retired now, they wanted to have an unconventional second honeymoon by trapping themselves inside the comfy cabin for the whole winter, with only each other for company. In 2013, they didn't have the internet and satellites that we have today, so they were going to be severely limited in the amount of contact they could have with the outside world. But both of them were fit and healthy, so they weren't too worried about running into trouble. In the event that something were to happen to one of them, at least they had a satellite phone to call for help if they had to. And the ancient cell phones of the day did get signal from inside the cabin. The rest of their food, books, generators, and board games were already at the cabin, just waiting for the winter, so that they could be cracked open and enjoyed. If their hunt went well tomorrow, the two would return to town for the next few weeks, before coming back with the last of their supplies, just in time to lock themselves in for winter. On their second-to-last morning on the lake, the two headed out to go fishing before everything froze over solid. They came back to shore in the early afternoon. The cabin was just a short walk from the dock, but even so, it was already cold enough to want to get indoors before the late afternoon, when the temperature dropped and predators like wolves and lynxes had a habit of prowling around the lakeside. Robert had left his hunting rifle up at the cabin, and he didn't like the idea of being caught out in the open without a weapon to defend himself and his wife. Their thoughts of predators weren't unfounded at all. The area was known to have just about every animal in North America, and the extra activity that the autumn brought for the wildlife also came with the pre-winter jitters that animals had when they were hurrying to settle down, and they could be quite unpredictable at this time of year. They tied their boat to the dock and started to make their way back home. Robert was carrying the fishing poles and the tackle box, and Nina had her 2 buckets of fish. They chatted as they walked and kept their eyes on the uneven ground before them. It was easy to take a tumble over a rock or twist your ankle in an indentation in the ground. They walked about 100 yards up the slightly sloping hill before they started moving through bushes and the first growth of the forest. Another 50 yards ahead, in the thick of the trees, stood their 2-bedroom log house, almost completely hidden from view. A few hours before they arrived, an old male black bear had begun to poke around the place. It came from the forest that morning when it caught a whiff of something edible. The old bear found 2 trash cans and spent the morning ripping open the bags, rummaging through the contents, and eating whatever it could find. By the time Nina and Robert came back, the bear had left a mess of strewn garbage at the back of the cabin, and it was quite annoyed. The food sure smelled promising all the way out in the forest, but there was so little in the plastic bins that its stomach wasn't even close to capacity. It had wasted all of the morning on just a few scraps, and now it had to start looking for food all over again this late in the day. Just as it was about to leave, it caught the scent of something else: fish. The bear smelled Nina's catch long before it even heard the couple's approach. It was just picking up speed, jogging toward the smell, when it stopped short at the sight of the people walking toward it. Nina and Robert both had their heads down and didn't notice the animal standing in the crop of trees. For a moment, the bear took in the situation. It was hungry, and Nina definitely carried the source of the promising smell. But black bears preferred to avoid humans if they could. The old bear wasn't stupid. It knew very well that people might seem small and weak, but they were an unpredictable species, and this kind of bear was naturally wired to avoid them when they could. Standing very still, the male mulled over what to do, but before he could make up his mind, the people were coming dangerously close to where he was standing. It was becoming increasingly nervous about their proximity, and the added smell of fish was grating on his senses, adding fuel to the winter jitters. The people were now just a few meters away from the unstable bear, which reared on its hind legs, letting out an ear-splitting roar. Nina and Robert nearly jumped out of their skin at the sudden blast of sound from the trees. The bear stormed forward a few feet, trying to show off as much of its 230 pounds as it could in the hopes of intimidating them. It still wasn't quite sure how to approach the situation, so it waited for them to make the first move. Apparently, they reacted the wrong way. Nina was slightly ahead of her husband when she dropped her 2 buckets, spilling the contents over the rocks beneath her feet, and she screamed. Robert rushed forward, placing himself between the animal and his wife, yelling and waving his arms as he went. This wasn't the first time Robert had come across a black bear, and all of them, even the ones as big as this one, ran away if you made enough noise, but he'd never walked into one head-on. The creature saw this as a direct attack, and its instincts took over. Its velvet coat shook majestically as it sped over the ground at the man who was posing the greatest threat. It streaked at an alarming speed, covering the 12 or so meters between them in just a few strides. Robert managed to shout at Nina to run just before the bear's massive body slammed into him, forcing the air out of his lungs and sending him crashing into the ground. The bear and man skidded across the rocky lakeshore, the jagged rocks tearing away the back of Robert's jacket as they went. Nina ran, and she didn't look back to see the animal on top of her husband, tearing with its paws and teeth at Robert's chest and head. But she did hear his agonized screams and the murderous growls and roars from the bear behind her. Nina reached the cabin in seconds, yanked open the door, and grabbed the rifle leaning against the wall. Nina was confident enough with the rifle. She'd had many turns during target practice, but she'd never actually had to use the weapon to bring anything down. Running and fumbling with it, she loaded the rifle as she made her way back to where Robert was. But when the scene came into view, her stomach dropped. The man laying on the ground was no longer recognizable as Robert. His entire upper body had been mauled so badly that there was little left to see of him except copious amounts of blood and the shreds that were once his face. The animal was still on top of Robert, and somehow Robert was still alive, his arms feebly grabbing onto whatever piece of fur he could. In the seconds that Nina had taken to get the gun and come back, Robert's screams had turned into bloody gurgles and painful gasps. She raised the weapon and pulled the trigger. Click, click, click. Nothing happened. The gun was jammed tight, so she struck the nose of it against a nearby rock and fired again and again and again. Still nothing, just that empty click. Nina, desperate and panicked, threw the entire gun at the creature, When the heavy metal shaft hit the bear, it lifted Robert, who had now stopped moving, into the air by its jaws and threw him aside. Robert landed with the dead weight of a stone several feet away. Nina grabbed one of her plastic buckets and threw that at the bear too. Enraged beyond reason, the animal then rushed at Nina. With only seconds to react, she managed to get hold of a sizable rock and threw it at the approaching creature, hitting it square on the forehead. That last stone saved Nina's life. The beast was momentarily dazed as she realized just how close it was to her. She could smell the earth and blood on its body and see the chunks of her husband's skin stuck in its muzzle. Nina did the only wise thing she could. She ran. She didn't look back. She knew she only had a few seconds before the animal came to its senses. The rock was just enough to buy her those precious few seconds, and she pumped her legs harder than she had ever done in her life. She skidded through the open door of their cabin, shutting it behind her. The bear had turned back to Robert when it shook off the blow. Seeing that the woman was nearly at the house, it didn't bother to go after her, not when the other one was already taken care of. Inside the log building, Nina scrambled to find her cell phone. The satellite phone that they carried for emergencies was strapped to Robert's belt, and there was no way to get it now. She found it and dialed 911. Before the operator answered, Nina was at the window, but the bear and Robert were both gone. Even from a distance, she could see the bloody drag marks that led into the forest. Sobbing and nearly incoherent, she tried to explain what had happened to the woman who finally picked up at the other end of the line. It took a good 10 minutes before the operator had some idea of the situation and a rough set of directions to get to the secluded place in the Alaskan wilderness. This garbled set of instructions, given by the hysterical Nina, made it difficult for emergency helicopters to locate the cabin. But from the air, the pilot spotted their blue Jeep standing out against the green and yellow of the autumn trees. By that time, it was already evening, and poor Nina was still huddled with her back to the door. She was taken away by air to be treated for shock at the closest hospital, even before the search for Robert began. All through the night and well into the next morning, rescue personnel and almost every person in a 50-mile radius of the lake came out to help. By the light of day, they could follow the bloody trail and finally locate Robert's remains hidden in a dugout den. The animal had obviously feasted on the man through the night, but there was no sign of the bear yet, so the search was widened. If bears attack once, the likelihood of them doing it again is almost certain. They couldn't take any chances. But in the end, the bear found them first. It came back to continue its feeding on Robert's remains, only to find a trooper standing at his hidey hole, and its kill was gone, taken away to the morgue the night before. The animal knew, after killing Robert, that this was an opportunity for another easy meal to add to its winter stash. But unfortunately for the black bear, this trooper did not have a rifle that jammed at the wrong moment. He became aware of the movement behind him and discovered the animal obviously stalking him, ready to pounce on the man from behind. When the other searchers and troopers heard the 4 shots ring out across the forest, they converged to the source of the blasts. They found the trooper alive and well, with a fully grown black bear lying dead at his feet. It was later confirmed with a necropsy that the animal indeed had Robert's remains in its digestive tract, so at the very least, the danger was removed from the area. But the lake stood devoid of people for almost 2 years anyway. Nina gave the cabin and surrounding property over to her children, but they didn't want to set foot in the place where their father had died either. So, in the end, it was sold off to another family who still makes use of it to this very day. But thankfully, no bear attacks have occurred there since Robert's terrifying final affliction.